This was a full court press to frame the Kennedy assassination, which broke the heart of this country, to frame it as a conservative plot when it was a leftist plot. So Trump made good on his promise, released thousands, I'm not sure how many thousands of documents relating to the John F. Kennedy assassination. And I want to talk about this conspiracy theory, especially because this has been going on right since I was a little kid, and which is, before the Civil War. And I will just say out up front, I have always believed that Lee Harvey Oswald killed John F. Kennedy because Kennedy was a staunch Cold Warrior who opposed the Russians and tried to get the communists out of Cuba. And Oswald was a Soviet sympathizing and Cuba sympathizing communist. And I believe that the CIA didn't want to release these documents because it showed them doing absolutely objectionable things, like breaking into the French consulate in D.C. and planning military attacks on Chinese nuclear facilities and injecting poison into sugar that was Cuban sugar that was bound for the Soviet Union. I mean, this is the stupid stuff the CIA was doing. And the CIA got very full of itself, still very full of itself. Guys like John Brennan, they're little tyrants, they're little Napoleons. And, it exposes a lot of the ugly stuff they're doing while they missed Lee Harvey Oswald, who they kind of tried to spy on him, but they didn't do a very good job of it, and he got through and killed the president of the United States. So they look like complete idiots, but I don't believe that they were actually behind the conspiracy. What's the Klavan on beneath this conspiracy? This is what I want to say, because people forget, and I'm going to go back in history. I know we never talk about anything that didn't happen yesterday because our attention spans are over, but we got to talk about this. Right after JFK was assassinated, and Lee Harvey Oswald, he tried to defect to the Soviet Union. He went to the Soviet Union to defect, and they wouldn't let him. They wouldn't let him in. Right after he was arrested, right? I'm going to read from James Pearson, also writing in City Journal. He said a struggle followed in the press right after this, and on television, to determine which issue would frame the assassination and define the public's understanding of it. Was the assassination an event in the Cold War, as it seemed to be in view of Oswald's involvement? That's obviously what it was. It was an event in the Cold War. Or did it represent another chapter in the ongoing crusade for civil rights? Was it support? We see this all the time. This happens. People go in and shoot somebody, and if they have a conservative agenda, that's all we hear about. If they have a leftist agenda, like transgenderism, they bury it, like they did with the shooter at the Nashville Christian School. They wouldn't let that out because it obviously revealed something true, which transgenderism, because it's at war with reality, is a violent movement. Then they ban it. So this is the start of that. This was the start of that. They did not want to admit that the Soviets, that the press sympathized with, many of them had been communists, many of them were still believed that this was the future and it worked. Remember, the New York Times actually conspired to hide Stalin's starvation of millions of Ukrainians by burying that story, then lying about that story. And so they sympathized with these guys. They were Reds, and they thought it was the conservatives who were going, no, the Reds are bad guys. The Reds are the bad guys. And the three words you can never say: conservatives were right. You cannot say those three words in America. And conservatives were 100% right. So they wrote all these stories. James Pearson, again, in City Journal, saying, leading journalists and political figures insisted that Kennedy was a victim of hate, which meant racial bigotry. It was created by racial bigots, the Ku Klux Klan, and anti-communist zealots, namely conservatives. They claimed that JFK had been killed because of his supports for a civil rights bill. James Reston, who was the chief political correspondent, wrote a front page saying Kennedy was a victim of the violent streak he sought to curb in the nation, meaning right-wing violence. And Chief Justice Earl Warren, who wrote the Warren Report, the investigation into the shooting, blamed quote-unquote bigots for Kennedy's death and never changed his mind. And so this was a full court press to frame the Kennedy assassination, which broke the heart of this country, to frame it as a conservative plot when it was a leftist plot. Are you browsing the internet with zero protection? Thou fool! That's like driving a car without insurance while texting, blindfolded, in a hailstorm. You might consider yourself a careful internet user, but have you seen the digital landscape lately? It's basically the Wild West, except instead of bandits, it's hackers trying to steal your banking information. Every single time you connect to one of those free Wi-Fi networks at your favorite overpriced coffee shop or that suspiciously sticky hotel lobby where people like me hang out, your data is basically a piñata waiting to be smashed open. And you don't need to be some elite hacker to do that. Literally any teenager with some cheap equipment can access your passwords, credit card card details, and more. I hate those teenagers. Your personal data is worth up to $1,000 to hackers on the dark web. Someone is willing to pay actual money to see your embarrassing search history. ExpressVPN creates an encrypted tunnel between your device and the internet that would take a hacker with a supercomputer over 1 billion years to crack. That's not the kind of time I have. So I'm going to use ExpressVPN like I do. I use it on everything. I use it on my computer. I use it on my phone and on my iPad. It just makes me feel secure. And the best part, it's ridiculously easy to use. You just tap one button and you're protected. It works on all your devices, so your phone, laptop, and tablet can all be secure. Find out how you can get 4 months free by scanning the QR code on screen, clicking the link in the description box below, or by going to expressvpn.com/Andrew Klavan Show. And Lee Harvey Oswald had already been arrested, and he, like I said, he was a communist, defected to the Soviet Union, he tried a couple of months before, he tried to shoot a conservative retired army general. He fired a shot through the guy's window, just narrowly missing him. So he was obviously a shooter, he was obviously the shooter. And this whole conspiracy, in my mind, was to cover this up. It's been a cloud that they put over the country to cover up the fact that it was people they liked, a philosophy they liked. Bernie Sanders going on his honeymoon to the Soviet Union, still pushing this crap. Young people who don't know better, still cheering for this crap. People still assigning Howard Zinn's communist hatred of America in their classes. Matt Damon selling it in his first movie. All of this stuff, Howard Zinn's, hateful book about America. The entire history, in my mind, of this part of the 20th century should be rewritten. In 1940 and 50, there was a trial. Alger Hiss was put on trial. This was a Soviet spy. He was working at the highest levels of government in the State Department. He helped frame the Yalta Conference, where the world was divvied up between the powers that won World War II, and Stalin got Eastern Europe. He was part of that. He helped with the formation of the United Nations, which was basically an attack on American sovereignty. He was exposed as a communist spy by Whittaker Chambers, who was a penitent spy who had worked with him. And you can read Witness, which is Whittaker Chambers' memoir of that. And it's a great, great book. It's a classic book, really worth reading. The press was totally on Hiss's side. He was one of them. He was upper class. They liked him, and so he's a little bit red, aren't we all, and they never forgave. The person they never forgave in this was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, as a congressman, went after Hiss and would not let him go, and he was proved right. And every time you see Carl Bernstein on CNN going, "This Trump is worse than Watergate," the only 3 words he knows, worse than Watergate. Watergate would not have happened if they were not trying to bring down Richard Nixon. I'm not saying Richard Nixon did nothing wrong, but John F. Kennedy his administration spied on Martin Luther King. He got us into Vietnam, and they took all of that and just wiped it out. It was all fine. And they went after Richard Nixon for the kind of peccadillos that he did. He's not that bad what he did. To nowadays, it would be swept under the rug, especially if Joe Biden did it. And Joe Biden did much, much worse. And so my point is that the whole idea that, how that the Kennedy assassination was a leftist, fantasy? Because the movie JFK was made by Oliver Stone. And that movie is one of the weirdest movies in American history, because Oliver Stone is an incredibly talented guy. And the movie is beautifully made, and it tells a true story about a New Orleans district attorney who believed it was Kennedy's assassination was a right-wing plot because Kennedy was going to pull out of Vietnam, untrue, and that he was going to shut down the CIA. And Kevin Costner played this heroic guy putting forward this complete fantasy. The reason it's such a weird movie, it's beautifully made. It's a total fantasy. It is a complete fantasy. Here's the scene where Costner delivers his impassioned, it must be going for 15 minutes, closing address to the jury. Just listen to this for a minute. Listen carefully. It's cut 13.
If the government is the truth, if we cannot respect the hearts of these people, then this is not the country in which I was born in, and it's certainly not the country that I want to die in. Tennyson wrote, "Authority forgets a dying king." This was never more true than for John F. Kennedy, who was probably one of the most terrible moments in the history of our country. You, the people, the jury system sitting in judgment on Clay Shaw, represent the hope of humanity against government power.
Now, I just want to point out that everything he says there is true. When the government lies, it's a terrible thing, then truth dies and all this, except for the part where he says, oh, Kennedy was a dying king. That was the way people the left felt about John F. Kennedy. He was a dying king. He was Camelot. He was King Arthur. He was the president. He was the head of the executive branch. That's all he was. He was a guy who abused women in horrible, horrible ways. He was a real sleazy guy in so many ways. And, there's no way to judge him as a president because his presidency was cut short. But look, people say these true things. The government's lying to, we're surrounded by lies. And then they put forward fantasies. And that's what that movie JFK does. This is an Oscar nominated movie and deserves it. It's a beautifully made movie, but it's complete nonsense. The jury walked out of that room and came back, I think under an hour. I think it was under an hour, and said, this is nonsense. We're not convicting anybody of this. So yes, the government has lied. Yes, they've censored you, but that does not mean that anybody who stands up against them is not serving something else that's, so people get up and say, oh, the government lied, and therefore George Bush bombed the World Trade Center, or the Jews, whatever the Jews are doing this week. The Jews are doing some terrible thing all the time. They're controlling the weather now, with their lasers. Just because the first part of that is true doesn't mean the second part is true. And I strongly believe that the Klavan here is that the left has rewritten and lied about the Cold War. That in the same way they gave Gorbachev the Nobel Prize instead of Reagan, whereas Gorbachev would have preserved the Soviet Union with his dying breath if it hadn't been for Reagan and Thatcher. And they just abuse Reagan and demonize him. And all they talk about is the Iran-Contra, scandal, but they don't talk about the fact that he freed a huge section of the world. They have rewritten that entire century in order to lie. And the JFK conspiracy, I believe, is part of that. Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist. He killed Kennedy because Kennedy was an anti-communist and a strong Cold Warrior. And all they're doing is trying to keep from saying those three forbidden words: conservatives were right. If you loved that, and I know you did, like and subscribe. And also subscribe to The Andrew Klavan Show wherever you get your podcasts.